I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 103 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending here with us in the room today, as well as through the Zoom application. Yes.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, je dois juste vérifier si...
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to confirm if the audio tests have been performed.
We have done the audio test. That is part of our preliminary rules of procedure here. Thank you for that, raising that, Mr. Perot. Now, I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit not only of the members here in the room, but also the witnesses, which are mostly virtual today. Before speaking, please do wait until I recognize you by name. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please do inform us immediately. In addition, I would like to highlight that this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, and feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injury. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or actually are in the room. Now, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 29th, 2024, the committee will resume its study of Canada's approach to Africa. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. We have with us today Professor Thomas Kwasi Tieko, who is a professor of international relations at King's University College at Western University. We also have Mr. Thierry Vircolon, the research fellow of the French Institute for International Affairs. From the Center for Strategic and International Studies, we're grateful to have Mr. Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow at the center. Now, each of our witnesses will be provided 5 minutes for their opening remarks. I would ask that every once in a while you do look over. Once you're almost out of time, I will put this up. That suggests or should tell you that you have approximately 10 to 15 seconds to wrap it up. That applies not only with respect to your opening remarks, but also when members are asking you questions as well. So all of that having been explained, we will now go to Professor Tieko. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Honorable Chair and members of the committee, for inviting me to contribute to this important study. This study is a signal to me that the Canadian political system is finally catching up with realities in our classrooms. Canadians, especially younger ones, want a stronger Canada-Africa partnership. The study presents a great opportunity to encourage the Canadian government to meet this expectation. Mr. Chair, I want to submit that the study should help transition Canada from the traditionally firefighting, risk-averse, and follow-the-crowd diplomatic posture to a more systematic, proactive, and strategic approach to Africa. Let me briefly outline what a systematic, proactive, and strategic approach to Africa may look like. Mr. Chair, a systematic approach to Africa requires a bipartisan policy framework that leverages Canada's strength and aligns Canadian interests with Africa's priorities. Luckily for Canada, many of the policy priorities that the African Union has identified in Agenda 2063 aligns nicely with Canadian interests. I will recommend that the Canadian government studies that document and its progress reports carefully. The Canadian government can then use the Canada-AU high-level dialogue to agree on a mutually beneficial policy priorities that reflect long-term strategic interests of Canada and Africa. One of such enduring interests is the maintenance and protection of the rules-based international order that has served both Canada and Africa very well in the last 70 years. Canada needs to work with the AU to counter threat posed by illiberal regimes to this order. Mr. Chair, a proactive Canadian approach to Africa means better reorganization and investment in Canadian field missions and the Africa branch. Our missions in Africa and the Africa branch are woefully understaffed and spread too thin in Africa. For instance, we have just one foreign service officer plus the ambassador in the Canadian mission to the African Union in Ethiopia. These two individuals are supposed to engage with over 1,700 AU staff and nearly 120 embassies in Addis Ababa. How are these individuals supposed to do it? Maybe they are magicians. Understaffing like this is part of the reason why we are generally perceived in Africa as very cheap on the diplomatic front. We need to invest in Global Affairs Canada and help it reform some of its outdated practices, such as the division of Africa into Sub-Saharan Africa and Arab Africa. Honorable Chair, a strategic approach to Africa entails identifying niche policy areas where Canada can make meaningful impact on the ground. Allow me to highlight a few of these areas. Number one, leverage Canada's linguistic advantage and partnership with the African Union to nurture a new generation of African leaders who embodied shared Canadian and African values as outlined in Agenda 2063. Two, utilize Canada's experience in conducting peaceful political transitions and multiculturalism to help African countries manage elections and diversity better. Three, leverage Canada's educational assets to help African states develop training programs that can transform Africa's youthful population into a demographic dividend. And finally, capitalize on Canada's agricultural expertise, technological advancements, Africa's vast arable lands, and young workforce to enhance food security and fight climate change. Mr. Chair, it is my hope that this study marks the beginning of a new era, one where we act smartly, play to our strength, stop hiding behind others, and put our money where our mouth is, and strengthen global affairs to do its best work. I thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to contribute to this study.
Thank you very much, Professor Tieko. We now go to Mr. Vauculon. You have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the committee for its invitation today, and I'll briefly talk about the political and security situation in the Sahel. It is critical. I'm not an expert of Canadian politics, but I specialize in the politics and the situation in the Sahel, and that is what I'm going to talk about. So we have to define the geographical zone very quickly. So it's a stretch of land stretching from the Red Sea to the Atlantic. So from Sudan to Mauritania, it covers 7 countries. And in recent years, there has been 3 major evolutions, if you will, each very critical that have taken place in this region. The first one has to do with the expanding conflicts in the Sahel region. Only 3 of the 7 countries are at peace, and those would be Senegal, Mauritania, and Chad. Now, there are 2 conflict theaters. One would be Mali and Burkina Faso, and the western part of Niger, and then you have, on the other hand, Sudan and its region. You have jihadism as an issue that started in the north of Mali in 2013 and spread to other countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, through 2 jihadist movements to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. One is the Islamic State of the Greater Sahara, and in the north you have Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb. If we are to talk about Burkina Faso, Mali, and west of Niger, there is also a system of multiple interconnected conflicts There is secessionism in the north of Mali between the Tuaregs and the central government, and there are intercommunal wars as well in the same region with numerous massacres. There are drug wars going on. Another conflict raging in the region is the civil war in Sudan, which started in April 2023, and it spread throughout the region. It became an international conflict. Now it's almost like a Middle Eastern war, of course, that stems from this conflict. Another issue that's critical in the region is the democratic regression. We've had an epidemic of coups. It started in Mali in 2020, and then 2022 in Burkina Faso, and then 2023 last year in Niger. So it's an epidemic of coups. Military administrations rather have replaced elected presidents. Then we had the failure of the Sudanese transition. It started in 2021. And the military also replaced the civilian government in this country. And in Chad, there has been this military transition that's been going on in 2021, supposedly to come to an end this year. So 4 of the 7 countries have undergone military transitions, and for 3 of them, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, there is no prospect of elections. A third evolution in the region is that's also critically important. It has to do with the reversal of diplomatic and security alliances. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have dismantled the security support system that had been introduced to combat jihadism. That was with support from the UN, the peacekeeping missions. The EU also sent troops. France also sent troops, and the United States still has significant intelligence assets. And as you know, MINUSMA was asked to leave the region. And we had accelerated rapprochement with Russia, and you had Russian paramilitaries that are now deployed in 3 of the 7 countries, and these Russian paramilitaries are taking part in combat in 2 countries, in Mali and in Sudan. Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, these 3 countries, have decided to cut ties with ECOWAS and exit this regional organization and create their alternative alliance of countries of the Sahel. And other countries of ECOWAS are not happy with the contagion of insecurity along their borders. So on top of the conflicts I referred to, there are internal tensions in this region on this front as well. This, of course, led to a dramatic humanitarian situations. Around 35 million people lost their lives, were killed in 2023, 2022, and 3. And we are currently looking at 11 million internally displaced peoples. And with that, I would like to conclude my remarks. I would like to thank the committee for its time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps you'll have an opportunity to address all the issues once we get into questioning from the members of Parliament. We next go to Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today regarding Canada's approach to Africa. You are examining this subject at a critical moment in Africa's history. You've no doubt heard, but it bears underscoring that the continent will be home to 1/4 of the world's population by 2050. Its natural resources, including 30% of the world's critical minerals that will power our modern world and help drive our economies, are found there. Moreover, it is situated at the geographic center of our world, along major sea lines in the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. The region holds 3 non-permanent seats in the UN Security Council, and it represents the largest regional voting bloc at the United Nations. With a median age of only 18 years old, President Biden was correct when he said that Africa will shape the future, and not just the future of the African people, but of the world. But today, the world is keenly aware of Africa's growing importance, spurring countries large and small to expand their political, economic, and security engagement with African states. But make no mistake, African nations and their leaders understand well their growing importance in the world and are demanding a greater voice in the global decisions that affect them and leveraging their diplomatic courtiers to obtain better deals for themselves and for their people. This influx of new actors and this renewed assertion of African agency is creating a highly dynamic and increasingly difficult to navigate environment for the continent's traditional friends, donors, and partners. At the same time, the region itself is also undergoing significant transformations to its own socioeconomic, political, and security landscape. That massive youth bulge is creating the greatest spread among the average age of leaders and the average age of citizens. The spread of nearly 60 years is a factor in the 9 coups d'etats African nations have experienced in the last 5 years and underpins the declining democratic trends across the continent today, which sees fewer people living under democratic rule than at any time since 1991. These developments, however, have been blunted by the convergence of growing incidences of armed conflict and terrorism, which today sees Africa as the global center of jihadism, climate change, which Africans rightly highlight they did not cause, but which they are paying the price for, food insecurity, and the COVID-19 pandemic-induced health and economic woes that have set back development gains on the continent by 20 years. Into this potent mix of forces and trends, the People's Republic of China sees the region as an opportunity. From Beijing's perspective, Africa is an untapped consumer market and a source for the commodities it needs to drive its expansion. But decades ago, it also saw in Africa an important arena to challenge the rules-based international order and advance its geopolitical interests. But China's engagement is not linear, and it would be a mistake to view it as wholly malign. Indeed, while China is perhaps seen as a global adversary across a host of important political, economic, and security sectors, the use of Africa as a chessboard only serves to undermine Western efforts to strengthen and deepen our partnerships there. Russia, too, in recent years has found in the region a permissive environment for parastatals and private military companies, often fomenting instability for strategic and financial benefit. Russia uses its security and economic ties, as well as disinformation, to undercut Africa's principled opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and related human rights abuses, and to sow dissent against Africa's traditional partners, portraying Moscow and the historical image as siding with Africa's independence-minded leaders against what many on the continent see as a kind of Western neocolonialism. Many African leaders see their countries as victims of the post-World War II international order. In their view, Western powers use international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to advance their interests while imposing painful conditionalities on African countries. Russian propaganda efforts did not create these views, but they do underscore them today to great effect. Similarly, the West's longtime support for African strongmen, from Zaire's Mobutu Sese Seko to Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang today, as well as its willingness to topple those opposed to its interests, as in the 2011 NATO war against Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, has hurt the West's credibility with African partners that it now tries to sell on an agenda of shared values. Both China and Russia are effectively using this history to advance their agendas. But make no mistake, China and Russia have identified and seized upon an opportunity in Africa, but they did not create it. The African Union has defined in its own strategic document, Agenda 2063, that the creation of a multipolar international system is in Africa's interests, multiplying its partnerships and requiring those partners to compete for African influence is a benefit. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hudson. We will now move to questions from the members. The first member up is MP Abul Taif. You have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Mr. Hudson, you said that, actually we know that China have invaded mostly Africa without having to fire one single bullet. We know that it's a region that's rich in resources, in minerals, that you said, minerals and population. And how can we navigate our way through Canada and U.S., not just only Canada, with China and Russia are well established here, and in specific, the competition that comes from China. How are we going to navigate our way through? China hasn't fired a bullet, and they were able to do what they did. What is the single recipe for us to be able to get through and establish ourselves with a future that is going to affect the world and is going to be shaping the world, as President Biden said?
Well, thank you for the question. That's obviously a question that we in Washington are struggling with as well, and I think all of our Western partners and donor countries are struggling with as well right now. I would say a couple of things. Number one, isn't so much what you can do, but what you shouldn't do. And what you shouldn't do is withdraw from Africa. We are seeing budget cuts. We are seeing personnel cuts. We are seeing a disengagement from certainly not just Washington, but from all Western partners from Africa. And I think now is certainly not the moment to step back. In fact, we need to be redoubling our efforts, as my colleague said, redoubling our embassy staff, redoubling our budgets. But I think in the process of doing that, one of the things that we need to be doing is treating African countries as equals, which again, I think in the Western world, we're wedded to this lexicon of, we see ourselves as donor countries, but this donor-donee relationship is something that Africans are trying to break away from. Right? There's a sort of parochialism there that is not helpful to the relationship. China sees Africa as, in many ways, as where China was 30 years ago. 40 years ago in its development. And in China, Africans see what their future could be, a future of moving from a poor agrarian society into a more advanced, industrialized, urbanized society successfully. So we have to find ways to create common cause, not separating ourselves through language, and certainly not separating ourselves by painting China exclusively, or even Russia exclusively, as a malign influence whose only interest is preying on, poor, susceptible African communities.
Were we caught by surprise in dealing with this issue? Because its time is not on our side, obviously, and we need to find a way. I believe that the African Union is one of the representatives. It's been sort of an organization that really carrying some business on behalf of the region, or mostly. So in the meantime, the African Union has been criticized for its inability to connect and impact to the life of Africans directly in its action through it has been remarked by better and promoting Africa in the international stage. And we seem to be working mostly with the African Union. Is that correct? And is this the right strategy?
Well, thanks for that question. I think that the African Union has emerged as the sort of preferred partner, but again, I think that what we're seeing now is the subcontinental level, the regional economic organizations demonstrating a greater ability to organize themselves and a greater ability to impact their own region and to police their own region. And so to the extent that it is possible, I think, what we've seen with the African Union is it tends to rise and fall on the quality of its chairmanship. And so when you have strong leaders from strong countries, when you have, a President Ruto or a strong Nigerian or South African leader, you can see the AU, or when President Kagame was the chairman of the AU, you see the AU, using the reins and the Secretariat of the AU to great effect. But when you have a president like the president of Comoros, our last chairman, or now the president of Mauritania coming from weaker states, the quality of the governance that comes from AU leadership is not often there in the same way.
Do you recommend for Canada to go alone on its own, or to go alone with our allies, specifically United States and Europe and Japan, the G7, to have more effective strategy in entering or re-entering Africa from on a different ground rather than what we have been doing in the past? What will be your recommendation or advice to Canada?
Well, what I can give you some window into how Washington approached it in part of the Francophone African world. I think Washington has been trying very discreetly, I think, to put distance between its policies and France's policies in Francophone Africa, and it has not served Washington particularly. We haven't benefited from that distance. You've seen, in just in the last month, Washington being invited to leave Niger. So I think that Canada really needs to think about creating its own path in Africa.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We next go to MP Zuberi. MP Zuberi, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to start off with Mr. Teku. And you talked about the AU's Agenda 2063. You just touched upon it very high level. Do you mind to elaborate a bit upon its strategy for us, for this committee?
Thank you so much for that question. I think for me, Agenda 2063 is a very important document that opens up the window for anyone who really wants to engage with the African continent, because it's seen as Africa's strategic document. Within Africa Agenda 2063, there are few things that I think are very important for Canada to pay attention to. Number one, for example, is that, and especially if you read the second report, is the emphasis on education. And there's a clear emphasis that they want to invite people to come and partner with them in terms of providing good quality education. And this is what we have. We have some of the best educational institutions in the world, not just in Canada, but in the world. And Africans who are educated in Canada, whether they are here, particularly when they go back home, they underperform. You can see it in the sciences, medical sciences, humanities, and everywhere. And we can partner with them to be able to enhance that. They emphasize the idea of transforming the agriculture into a mechanized one. We have the technology to be able to do it. It's about 100 billion industry, and we have the expertise to be able to leverage it and gain from that particular thing. I can go on and talk about a number of other initiatives that is on Agenda 2063. We just need to study that document and align it with our interests, and I think the Africans will welcome it.
I think that's really helpful, and the point on education really is salient, especially since in the testimony we know that the average age is 18 for those on the continent. In terms of strategies, you touched upon the Agenda 2063. In terms of other strategies and frameworks, and this is to all the witnesses, are there any that you want to highlight for us in terms of naming them and also identifying salient elements of them, aside from what has already been mentioned in your testimony? I open this up to all the witnesses. We have about 2.5 minutes, so I just ask that brief responses.
If I may go first, I
Yes.
just want to add a little bit to it. I've heard a number of other testimony witnesses emphasizing the importance of bringing in the regional economic communities. So I would also emphasize, and for me, it will be very important to also have a permanent delegation to these regional economic communities.
That's, I think, a very good way of looping into the testimony we heard last time. So focus on the regional areas, the 5. I heard that. Do you think that we should have a presence in each of the 5?
Yeah, mine say yes, because we don't have enough, right? We are only present in about 17 of them. And we are spread too thin. So, but if you strategically position in all the regions, all the regional economic community, and then use them as a contact point for those countries, and then that will free us to be able to then strategically position other missions in the areas that reflect our core interests. And no one would complain about it. The way we've done it at the moment, everyone is going, why is Canada establishing a mission here, but not a mission here? And we don't have the money to be everywhere. Almost 60% of African countries, we are not present. So strategic repositioning is the way to go. Thank you so much.
And to Mr. Hudson, you spoke about the challenges in Sahel. What aside from what you already mentioned, do you want to add anything on how we can constructively contribute to addressing those challenges?
I think that was Mr. Rocolon who spoke about the Sahel.
Monsieur Vercolon, est-ce que vous avez des points à ajouter?
Mr. Verculon, would you like to add anything? I talked about three big changes: the suppression of democracy, and we already have that in your written testimony, but would you like to add any other points? Well, when it comes to this region, those will be the three main issues. Perfect, thank you.
So next we go to Mr. Perron. Vous avez 5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being with us today and for taking the time. Mr. Virculon, let's start with you. You referred to a series of coups, and that covers Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and up all the way up to Guinea. What sort of an impact could the relationship between these countries and countries like Canada and France help stabilize the situation? I'd like to hear your opinions on that. Well, the impact of France and Canada would be very different because France has been very much involved on the military front in the war against jihadism. There's been a rupture of diplomatic ties with Mali and Niger, so the French armed forces left these countries. But for Canada, I do not really know about the relations that Canada could or has had with these particular countries. But as I was saying, France and UN and the EU have all been rejected in this region. Western countries have been rejected, including the United States. And I believe Canada should stay and keep demonstrating solidarity with its American allies and European allies and consult with them to define its position when it comes to the three military juntas that we're talking about. Well, maybe I did not ask my question very clearly, but to go back to, or rather, maybe Canada can play an auxiliary role as a third country. But how can we help? You referred to consultations. Yes, but should we try to have more diplomatic contact, increase our presence in the region? I'd like to hear your opinions on that. Well, I don't think that these regimes would be open to that. It's simple as that. These regimes are developing their own military cooperation, and they'll try to develop as well economic cooperation with Russia. And as we speak, they reject Western presence, not just Western presence, but also the regional West African organization, ECOWAS, as well. So playing the role of a mediator or a dialogue actor with people who are not in a dialogue posture wouldn't be diplomatically very realistic. Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Very honest answer. We are trying to find ways of helping out and playing a role in the region to encourage the eventual return of democracies. Can you talk to us about the situation in Senegal? You gave us a bit of good news with the presidential elections. Would Senegal be a positive case? Should it give us hope? Yes, Senegal is the good news because the President Macky Sall's attempt to stay in power failed with the elections that took place last year, and there are new powers emerging. But I believe we need to wait and see because there's a new government in Senegal that is being formed. It has a Pan-African agenda, and we will have to wait and see, wait at least a couple of months to see whether they will choose the political path taken by neighboring military juntas, or will they be a bit more moderate when it comes to Westerners? At the moment, no one knows the answer, so we will have to wait and see, wait to have the government in place to see their first diplomatic gestures, to see their inclinations. Well, can we not help or like intervene or have a role to play, or is there a role for us to play in the lead up to this process to encourage maybe better relations with the West? Well, all Western democracies should be proactive vis-à-vis the newly formed Senegal government without being too pushy. And while we're waiting to see their first actions and demands, well, rather than doing that, we can actually reach out, but that could be interpreted by this government as a form of oppression. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Perron. We next go to Ms. McPherson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank all of the witnesses today for being with us. This is such a large topic, and there's so many things that we can discuss. I think what I would start with, you know, we've heard so much about Sudan. We've heard so much about the devastation that's happening in Sudan right now. Mr. Hudson, I know that you wrote about the situation inside Sudan being desperate, being a virtual collapse of state authority. Could you talk a little bit about, you know, what could have been done to prevent what's happening in Sudan, what the international community and Canada in particular can do to help build peace, and what lessons we should be learning from the conflict that we see in Sudan right now?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, the conflict in Sudan, I think, was entirely predictable. You've had an army in need of reform for more than a generation, and it being attacked by a militia of its own creation, and a militia that carried out a genocide in Darfur 20 years ago. And so what brought them to this battle was an effort to reform both and to incorporate both into one new national army. So we could have seen this coming, I think, much further away, and we didn't take the steps because I think there wasn't an appropriate diplomatic coalition that was underpinning the negotiations that were going on between these two parties. They were left in many respects to their own devices to negotiate a way forward. And then when there was little recourse but to fight, there was no one there to step in to prevent them from taking this step. And so I think it's been a lack of diplomatic attention leading up to this battle. And of course, once the battle began, we were all caught, I think, a bit flat-footed. Most Western embassies in the early days of this conflict, when we could have perhaps steered it on a different course, we were all far too concerned with getting our own nationals out of Sudan, getting our own diplomats out of Sudan in the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of the fighting. That when that happened, we lost our footing in the country. We lost our ability to impact decision making by those leaders, and we have been, I think, in a diplomatic deficit ever since this conflict started, which we are only now beginning to try to gain back some momentum. There was a conference in Paris earlier this week. We've reached this 1 year anniversary. We now have an envoy, a special envoy from the United States. But when I worked on Sudan 20 years ago, there were a dozen special envoys. There was a diplomatic tempo that was maintained over the course of many months. That is missing. I think many Western countries have allowed Gulf state actors to take a much greater role in trying to not even mediate, but to direct this conflict in ways that benefit their interests. And so I think that we need to see really a reassertion of the kind of the Western human rights values around this conflict going forward. If we hope to see this come to a positive conclusion, not just for our own interests, but for the interests of the Sudanese people.
Thank you. Mr. Tieku, I saw you nodding as well. Did you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
I think so. I think he's got it spot on. But what I will add to it is that if we had proactively work behind the scenes with the African Union, because the African Union has been engaged in that particular discussion, but it was isolated in the international system because there were so many tracks that were put in place. So number one would have been a better engagement with the African Union, could have actually forestalled some of them. But the other broader point is the fact that we leave African countries we leave the most important, which is leadership, just to nature to be able to devise it. Just imagine that we have set aside the $3 billion that we spent on the African continent, for example, specifically training the next generation of African leaders. You see a different thing would have emerged on the Sudan. So we have to be proactive rather than reactive. And that is the more reason why I use the word that we have to move away from the firefighting. It's too expensive, but because doing the long-term thing is not the most sexiest thing, we don't invest in it. What I'm saying is that we have to reposition ourselves to be more proactive and prevent some of these things from happening.
So very much the investment in diplomatic efforts. And, I think that idea of the diplomatic coalition and the gap that was there for that, I think is very key. I think, how much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
Time is over, Ms. McPherson.
Well, then that's that for that.
Thank you. So we go to the next round. For this round, 3 minutes for the Conservatives and the Liberals. Mr. Chong, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask Cameron Hudson a follow-up question to Madam McPherson's question. You mentioned that the most recent conflict in Sudan might have been headed off if there was an appropriate Western diplomatic coalition and intensive diplomatic work in the early weeks of that conflict. But I'd like you to take a step back from that particular unconstitutional change in power. And you referenced in your opening remarks 9 coups d'etats in Africa recently, 7, I believe, in the Sahel since 2020. What is driving these unconstitutional changes in power?
Well, thank you for that question. That could be a PhD dissertation. So let me just try to give you a couple of reference points. As I referenced in my testimony, I think one of the trends that we are seeing is this spread among many aging leaders and a young population demanding and seeing, frankly, online and seeing on social media what freedom looks like and what democracy looks like and what human rights looks like, and recognizing that they don't have those things where they are. And so the world has become much smaller through social media and the internet. And so as you have these aging leaders holding on to power more and more, either through judicial and legislative means or through outright, coups d'états and the like, I think that's one factor, is the social tensions that exist in the country. I think there's also more globally speaking, a rise of illiberalism. It's the influence and the power that alternative models are being presented by Russia, by China, to these countries. I think as we talk about Africa increasing their partnerships and wanting to increase their partnerships and not being dependent upon these kind of donor relationships that have defined much of the post-independence period for them, They see in China and in Russia and in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE and in Turkey and in all these new partnerships different political models that they can also use as reference points. And so I think you're seeing a dilution of our influence.
Just quickly on this, does economic growth have anything to do with it? You know, in the Arab Spring, the argument was made that, you know, contracting economies in the Arab world were responsible, but it seems to me that Africa's growing at a fairly rapid clip, at least most of Africa. Does economic growth or negative growth in some of the African countries have something to do with it, in countries like Libya and Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, and some of the other countries that we're seeing?
I think it's both. Yeah, I mean, I think it's both the economic growth and it's the distribution of wealth in these countries. If you look at a conflict like Sudan, what put people in the streets in Sudan was the failing economy.
Thank you. We next go to MP Khalid. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Really appreciated what you all had to share with us today. I really believe that with a post-colonial Africa, the boundaries as drawn for all of these nations has a big role to play in how conflict is occurring and why that conflict seems to become more and more permanent, as Monsieur Virculon, you had said when you were talking about the DRC. I want to talk about that relationship with the global North and with Africa and the multilateral partnerships. Now, Canada, as I'm hoping that you're aware, has a Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise to manage humanitarian efforts and human rights while conducting enterprise. So perhaps if you can, and I would ask each of you to briefly comment on this, what roles do you think specifically Canada can play to empower as opposed to, and to find that balance of working with African nations as opposed to being just a donor state, if you can. We'll start with Monsieur Virculon, please. Virculon first.
Je suis pas sûr de bien comprendre la question.
I'm not sure if I fully understood the question when you refer to rendering these countries autonomous. They're autonomous and sovereign states. And they are reminding that to us by the policies they're leading, by multiplying the partnerships they have. It's quite disorganized, this policy, and it's not really strategically well thought out. I think we need to focus on converging interests to answer your question, and we need to ask ourselves the question to know what the converging interests would be between Canada and not Africa, because Africa is 54 states, but some African countries. And it's based on this convergence of interests that a dialogue and the real partnership can be built, because there's a lot of reference to partnerships, but there are many partnerships in lacking partners. To have really efficient partnerships, there needs to be a real convergence of interests.
Sorry, who was it for? Professor Tieko, you have no more than 15 seconds to respond, please.
My goodness, I think, colonialism is part of it, but one single thing that is a major driver of instability and challenges on the African continent apart from borders is food. If you read the literature carefully, anytime there's food insecurity, usually it's followed by political unrest, and usually political actors take advantage of it. You fix food insecurity, in most cases, chances are that you are likely going to have much more better stability.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Khalid. We now go to Mr. MP Perron. You have a minute and a half.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Virculon, The Democratic Republic of Congo, there is a progressive return of the MONUSCO force. What should be our conclusions from that, and what do you think will be the ramifications for the near future? And as a follow-up, again, in relation to the Democratic Republic of Congo, is it a governance issue or a security issue? The UN peacekeeping force in the DRC is leaving at the end of year or the beginning of next year. That's the timing. We will see if these timelines will be respected, and that sort of signals the end of large peacekeeping missions in Africa, because the government of Mali also asked the UN to leave, and then the mission in Darfur ended in 2019. So there are only two remaining big missions, more than 10,000 people in South Sudan and Central African Republic. So these missions, both in Mali and in the DRC, the request came from the respective governments. Mali is a particular case, but when it comes to MINUSMA, the mission was created in 1999. We're in 2024, and we have 7 million internally displaced peoples in the east of Congo, 150 or so armed groups. So the general outlook is quite negative, and it represents billions in expenditure per year too. Thank you.
A final minute and a half, we go to MP McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Tieku, listening to your testimony today, I wonder if you could comment on the youth, peace, and security agenda. It seems to me that having young people involved in peacekeeping is a key here. That's what I'm hearing from you. Could you expand on that a little bit for us, please?
I agree that having the youth in different aspects of the African political life is going to be key. You have exactly people, the average median age is 18.8, for example, and yet you have the median age of African leaders is about 62, right? There's that mismatch. So having the youth in different aspects is going to be very important. Having them in peacekeeping operation can be very, very important, especially women. Having the women in the peacekeeping operation can be very, very important. It can be one way of also distracting them from also getting mobilized and joining armed forces or terrorist group, right? So that peacekeeping piece can be very, very helpful. So I agree with you that getting the youth involved in peacekeeping will be very helpful.
Well, and certainly we've got a fantastic ambassador for peace, women, and security, and it's been shown time and time again that peace is more stable, more likely to be maintained if women and young people are at the table. I think that's excellent. Mr. Hudson, anything that you'd like to add in the very short time that I have left?
No. Thank you.
10 seconds, please.
Thank you. I think that's all I'll do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. So allow me to thank Professor Tieku, Monsieur Vaucoulon, and Mr. Hudson. It was very, very insightful, and I know on behalf of all the members of this committee, we're very grateful for your time and expertise. This meeting stands adjourned suspended for 5 minutes. We don't know when the voting's taking place, Mr.
Mr. Chair, before you suspend, I think there's been discussions amongst with members from all the parties on this committee, and I think if you seek it, you'll find unanimous consent that the committee continue to hear from the next panel, that the committee suspend when there are 5 minutes remaining on the bells, and that the committee come out of suspension when Madam McPherson has rejoined us virtually after she has attended to her duties as whip in the House of Commons.
Is there unanimous consent? Sure. Yes, excellent. Meeting stands suspended. I'd now like to welcome new witnesses. We're very, very grateful to have Professor Mandé from the Université de Quebec and to have Mr. Landry Signé from the Brookings Institute. Professor Mandé, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Merci.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you warmly for this invitation to appear before you and to talk to you about cooperation with the African continent. Well, when we talk about cooperation with Africa, we have to accept a certain vision that we have of Africa. And as it is, that vision should reflect what Africa really is and not what we think it is, because it might not be in that particular way. In a general sense, the general approach seems to be very critical of West and the Western countries, and that's the general opinion of the Global South. And when we talk about cooperating with Africa, we should talk about a mutually beneficial strategy, both for countries of the North, Global North, and African countries. Previous speakers also mentioned this, but we need a multilateral cooperation that takes into account the needs of the African continent and the priorities as outlined and defined by the African Union's Agenda 2063. In that document, there are very clear documents and aspirations, and we can go back and talk a bit more about that document. So cooperating with Africa, as I mentioned, is fueled by bias and prejudices. There's often reference to a continent of disasters, lack of innovation, lack of empowerment, and that the continent is permanently in need of assistance of all kinds. Humanitarian, food, medical, etc. So there is little attention, unfortunately, is paid to the expertise and the needs and wishes of the continent's populations, but these are widely expressed by surveys such as those conducted by Afrobarometer, which targets 39 countries on the continent with a sample of over 50,000 people, and in Mali as well. There are similar mechanisms and strategies that are used to take into account the public opinion. With that said, let's go into a bit more detail. Well, medium and long-term economic and social development issues and objectives, such as those formulated by concerned countries, must remain at the forefront of Canada's foreign policy, and these should not be marginalized by short-term security concerns, because more and more this is what we're seeing. Security concerns seem to dominate the debate around the African continent, but there should be other aspects to the policy, social, economic, and otherwise. There's also a tendency to isolate regimes that have emerged from recent coups. But these should not be marginalized, because when you marginalize a political regime, you marginalize populations, but they need to be accompanied in a perspective of medium-term change in order to keep the political space open. That's very important. And as we speak, if we take the example of Burkina Faso, a country I happen to know a bit more about, there are over 2 million people who are internally displaced, and more than 4,500 schools in the country are closed. So how do these populations live? There's, of course, the question of insecurity, but we need to have a bottom-up approach, and we have to think about how citizens of these countries and people on the ground experience security issues. There are armed attacks, organized crime, and also food insecurity comes into place. And if we take the Burkina Faso example, there 25% of terrorism acts in the world took place in Burkina Faso in 2023. Economic relationships should also be reinforced with African countries, and there are bilateral investment treaties and private investors take part in some of these agreements. And these bilateral investment treaties have direct impacts on the policies adopted by developing countries. Similarly, it has an impact on the emergence of economic development policies. Another topic that is often debated when it comes to the relations between Canada and the African continent will be the following. Mining companies, the way they behave on the continent, really should be looked into. There is a mining framework that is not always respected, and Canada has an ombudsperson, as we all know, to ensure the...
I'm afraid we've hit the 6-minute mark, which means that you will have an opportunity to raise all the issues you meant to raise during questions from the members. However, prior to going to Mr. Signé for his opening remarks, I just wanted to inform you both that the bells are ringing, which means that the members need to cast a vote. So we will suspend for approximately 12 minutes, and then we will resume with Mr. Signé's 5 minutes of opening remarks. Thank you. Suspend. Mr. Signier, the floor is now yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Please do look over every once in a while, because once you're very close to the 5-minute mark, I will hold this up, which means that you should be wrapping things up within 10 to 15 seconds once you do see that black phone. The same applies when members are asking questions, because we have 5 minutes allotted to each party. So by unanimous consent of all the members, after we hear from you, Mr. Signier, we will open it up to questions, and each party will be provided 5 minutes. So, Mr. Signier, please do proceed.
Greetings and thank you very much. Bonsoir et merci.
Good evening and thank you very much.
Vice Chair Michael Chong et Vice-Président Stéphane Bergeron, and distinguished members of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. I am incredibly honored and grateful for the unique opportunity to testify on Canada's approach to Africa. I'm Professor Landry Signier, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, but also Executive Director and full Professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management and co-chair of the World Economic Forum Regional Action Group on Africa. It is time for Canada to claim the place it deserves in Africa, as many traditional and emerging global powers are racing to capture Africa's tremendous economic potential, the next world growth market. I would like to share a few key trends. By 2030, the combined consumer and spending in Africa will exceed $6.7 trillion for 1.7 billion people. By 2050, the Africa's combined consumer and business spending will exceed $16.12 trillion for 2.53 billion people. And by the end of the century, Africa will have about 40% of the global population. In 2024, 12 of the world's fastest growing economies will be based in Africa, and the continent is the second fastest growing region in the world. Another trend, the expanding global and continental partner of Africa. With the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Africa is now home of the largest free trade area in the world. The AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, could lift about 30 million Africans out of poverty, increase income of 68 million other Africans, and increase export by at least 560 billion, plus generating more than 450 billions of potential gain for African economies by 2035 per the World Bank study. Canada has sustained competitive advantage to partner with Africa, advance Canada trade and investment with the continent, while meeting the majority of Africans' prosperity, thus achieving mutual prosperity. I will be happy to expand on specific sectors during the conversation. But let me just finish by sharing a few specific recommendations. It's important for Canada to develop a new type of commercial diplomacy, identifying and disseminating the tremendous Africa potential sector per sector. Canadian corporations deserve to better understand the dynamics in Africa and the opportunity present on the continent. Canada can also leverage its higher education to provide technical training and reskilling to bridge the digital gap. Similarly, it is possible to capitalize on the African diaspora. Myself, born in Cameroon, I'm also proud to be Canadian. I was a recipient of the Banting Fellowship for the best and brightest postdoctoral scholars. So Canada has given me a phenomenal opportunity, and most African from the diaspora are grateful and willing to give back to Canada. In conclusion, by acting promptly and forging transformative partnerships aligned with African values, Canada has the opportunity not only to advance its own interest, but to contribute to the transformation of Africa, whether in transport and logistics, in pharmaceutical, agriculture, agri-industry, automotive industries, among others. I will pause now and looking forward to a lively conversation. Thank you so much again for offering me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Signier. We now go to MPEP. You have 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. As has come out from several sectors, the testimony is showing that Canada is definitely behind. Just using one measure, trade, the U.S. has got 1,800 deals in 49 countries, about $85 billion in trade. China, $257 billion. These are all 2022 numbers, and Canada, I believe, is around $9.4 billion in trade. So we've got to play catch-up. This study is timely. I am concerned, and I'm open to be challenged, that in our attempt to develop a strategy that will become too broad-based. So I'll start with a question to both of you. Should Canada, as we develop the strategy, be focused and strategic, or be much broader, trying to get to 54 countries, multiple sectors? I mean, there's trade, there's security, development. You know, where should we go from an overall approach? Let's start with Professor Monday and then Professor Signier.
Je pense que
it's a very interesting question, because Canada has a very well recognized expertise in some regions of Africa. So having a strategy that takes into account, or rather covers, investments in certain regions, but also, on the other hand, bringing into play the expertise in some fields of activity, a combination of the two, in my opinion, would be the best approach. Of course, covering or trying to cover all 54 countries wouldn't be the best, because you would be spreading yourself too thin. And Africans have already defined what priority sectors are for themselves. It's Agenda 2063, that document. So in this document, once you take a look, you get an understanding of the aspirations of these countries, and clearly defined objectives for infrastructure, road networks. So Canada can build a Dakar-Djibouti highway or railroad as well.
Go to Professor Signier. I'm going to one follow-up question. Where is that sweet spot, that intersection between the AU 2063 document and Canada's expertise? We have expertise in agriculture, extractive industries. Where is that that intersection with what Africans want? And a very short answer, if I can, so I get Professor Signier to have an opportunity as well.
le point d'intersection.
The point of intersection, I think, lies at the infrastructures level. Mining, or of course, is very well known, but dams. There is a project in Zinga that is always highlighted as a key example. So for the autonomy of the center of the continent, but also the west of the continent, Hydro-Quebec's experience, or Hydro One's experience, can also come into play. There are other elements as well.
To be fair, Professor Signier.
Thank you so much. This is an extremely important question, and I think the focus should be trade and investment. African countries need more trade and investment, and I think that is what provides the best mutual interest between African and Canadian corporations, but also citizens. Let me be very specific about the sector. The African Continental Free Trade Area is creating a single market. So now we are not anymore speaking about 55 countries. We are speaking about one single market. And as of now, 54 of the 55 members of the African Union have signed the African Continental Free Trade Area. So that's one dimension. Now, if I am specific about some sector, in automotive sector, for example, in automotive industry, so Africa will need between 4 and 5 million vehicles by 2035. So which means that about 20 additional full-size manufacturing plants could be created on the continent only in the automotive industry. Speaking about agriculture or agri-industry, here too, the market is projected to reach $1 trillion by 2030, and Canada has also a phenomenal advantage there. So transport and logistics. The continent will need for intra-African trade approximately 2 million new trucks, 100,000 rail wagons, 250 aircraft, and more than 100 vessels by 2030. So those are areas where Canada has a sustained competitive advantage, and where it is possible to start today. Not tomorrow. It is possible to engage in an engagement today, and as long as we respect the rule of origin, starting in a given country means that the entire continent could be leveraged. And I'm happy to expand on those. My latest book, Unlocking Africa Business Potential, share many of those trends.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We next go to Madame Chattel. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Professor Mande, Professor Signé, welcome to our committee. I will ask a similar question. Professor Signé, you referenced your book, Unlocking Africa's Business Potential. You talk about agriculture in this book as an interesting sector for those looking to increase trade with the African continent, but you also talk about potential risks in your book. So you talked about certain sectors. I have 2 more questions if I can get a brief answer. Thank you very much. There are many risks that we should be aware of on the African continent. One is political risk. We have seen in many countries examples of this. There have been coups or interruption of constitutional order, so this risk needs to be taken into account. And there's also the cost of doing business, or the cost of infrastructure, transportation networks. These vary a lot and have to be taken into account. There are admin delays and the number of documents that are required to import or export. That also is another risk. There is payment risk as well. But there are solutions for these risks. For instance, insurance, risk insurance, that could help you manage these issues. Thank you. You talked about the African single market, and you were saying that this could help lift more than 30 million people from extreme poverty, and there's a report that references 50 million people whose incomes will go up significantly. So what kinds of impacts could we expect to see on the security front if people's economic security is improved? Is the single market really the key to solving a lot of issues on the African continent, and should we really support it with this expectation? Well, I am really impressed that you have read a number of my works, and I'm very honored by that. The second chair of the Thunderbird School of Management had a saying whereby he references borders connected by trade not needing to be guarded by soldiers. So once you have these economic relations, it reduces the risk of conflict, and I do share this opinion. So achieving this or having success with the single market is key, and that will play into increasing security. And that will, of course, be quite attractive for investors, and many ties will be created by these economic exchanges, and these will also further reduce the chances of armed conflict because there will be mutual interests. Thank you. I don't have much time, but another question would be the following. You have a lot of experience in sustainable development, and you sit on some councils and boards. What do you think will be the impacts of climate change on geopolitical issues in Africa? Climate change play an extremely important role in the Sahel especially, and sometimes they're directly the reason for major upheavals. We recently published a report on that issue, and I was the co-author of a report that looks into climate change on the one hand and sustainable development solutions on the other. Yes, we have to envisage solutions to the challenge of climate change, and that will help reduce conflict risk, among others, because climate change has an impact on the well-being, on available resources, and other key areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Signé. We next go to Mr. Perron. 5 minutes, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our two witnesses. We really appreciate you taking the time. I would like to start with Professor Mande. You talked about a relationship that's on an equal footing and that has advantages for both sides, and you referred to African immigration to Canada. There are advantages to it, and we are recruiting healthcare workers from Africa as we speak, but Africa is in dire need of these professionals. So how could the immigration policy be adjusted? Does it create frustrations in Africa, or how could we have an immigration framework that would be a win-win situation for both sides? Thank you very much for this question, and of course, immigration should be advantageous for the immigrants themselves and the country, the host nation, the host country as well. But equally, this applies to the community. So it should be a win-win-win situation with three parties to it. When we talk about the issue of healthcare professionals' mobility, there is an observation by the World Health Organization that says the solution isn't to keep moving around this professional resource from origin countries, for instance, to other places. But we've seen this in Zimbabwe and other countries. What is necessary is institutions to train healthcare professionals for countries of the global south as well. So when these professionals come over here, they need additional training. So that's where you need a strategy. So healthcare professionals who are destined to go to the global north should receive this kind of training, maybe before coming over here. Thank you. We also have an issue with visas and study permits for students coming from African countries. There's an abnormally high refusal rate that's been recognized and accepted by the government, so that was a problem. What has been the impact of that in Africa or at your university? Is it ill-perceived in Africa? Does it create a lot of friction? Or do they just adjust and keep going? It does create frustrations. And I take a personal interest in this question at the level of our university. And frustrations also stem from the image of Canada. There's an opportunity here because France has traditionally been the host country or welcoming country for African students, but they've been distancing themselves from France recently. So African countries have chosen to prefer Quebec more and more. These students, foreign students or international students at our university, one course is $2,500. A Quebecer student is paying $400, which is completely normal. But the difference in between the payments also allows bursaries for Quebec students. Thank you. I apologize for interrupting, but we seem to share the same feeling. We've been shocked by this. We've also seen a reduction of the investments by Canada in the International Organization of the Francophonie. Is this a signal that's being sent? I mean, we want French-speaking students, but we are withdrawing ourselves from the international organization. How is that perceived? I think there is a governance problem with the Francophonie, the International Organization of the Francophonie, and Quebec and Canada have had relations. And there is the General Assembly that's coming up, but there are governance issues. Otherwise, Canada has been a leader in the French-speaking world. So it's a very good manner of being present in Africa and having some influence, of course. But there is a problem on that front. Thank you very much.
We now go to Ms. McPherson. You have the final 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all very much today for being accommodating for me to, oh, I've lost my screen, to run down and be part of the voting. And I also wanted to thank our witnesses for being here today. It's been very interesting. Mr. Signé, I'm going to start with you, and I just want to give my greetings to my colleague, John MacArthur, who I know you have an opportunity to work with, and I appreciate you wearing the SDG pin today as well. I think that's it's lovely to see. One of the things that you have written about, Mr. Signé, is the idea of fragility and how we identify fragile states, how we respond to fragile states. And one thing that was very interesting to me is that you have observed that some of the fragile states are amongst the lowest recipients of aid. Now, Canada has an ODA Act. Our dollars are meant to go to helping those that are most in need. Why is that? Should it be that way? And how do we fix it, I guess, is my question for you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to engage, and I will say hello to John. His office is not far from mine. So that's an extremely important question because the most fragile countries are also the one where we have the highest concentration of poverty, especially of extreme poverty, and the one where extreme poverty is also likely to grow in the coming decades. So not providing resources to those countries is quite alarming. And some of the reason is also because there is a lack of awareness. So there's less political momentum and less consequences of inaction because people, the broader public, care typically less about those. So, and I like to use the kingdom approach of public policy. Policies are on the agenda when the problem, the policy, and the politics are aligned. The problem, the solution, and the awareness of the public are aligned. So that's one point. Now, in terms of solution, I propose in the book chapter that you are referring a city-based approach versus most of the approach when they consider the country from a central dimension where many of the problems are based in either the city or in specific regions. So which allow to target and act more effectively. But I also propose a business-based one, a business approach to solve fragility, because by only focusing on public player on, so who are also often part of the challenges. Let's say, we leave behind citizens, especially entrepreneurs, younger people, but women as well, who represent about 80% of cross-border trade among other, and who are also the most affected in those areas. So those are the two key dimensions. And the third one is to focus on implementation. So a lot of policies are developed and typically copied from one country to another or from one program to another without sufficiently taking into consideration the complexity of the context, including in the same country or in the same region. What will work in Mali may not work in Burkina Faso. And even, let's say, in Cameroon, what will work in the northern part of Cameroon may not work in the southern part in Bamenda. What will work in Garoua may not work in Bamenda. So it's important to contextualize, and not just at the continental or at the country level, but also within country level.
Yeah. And I think, too, one of the things to keep in mind as well is that by failing to meet the needs of fragile states, it makes them much more likely to descend into conflict in many circumstances, which, of course, then spirals and spreads to other parts of regions. One last very quick question. I know I'm going to run out of time, but one very last quick question for you, Mr. Signé. Right now, the government of Canada, we had been excited that there was going to be a strategy or a policy for Africa. Then we were told that there was going to be a framework. The Global Affairs Canada staff earlier in this study have told us that it is now an approach. Does that worry you? Does that degrading of what we're looking from the government of Canada worry you?
I think it is extremely important to have a clear policy for Africa strategy with a specific timeline, with specific goals and indicator of success.
Thank you very much. I think that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you.
On that note, I will thank Professor Mande and Dr. Signé for your valuable time and expertise. We're very, very grateful you could join us. In particular, Dr. Signé, it's great to have your Canadian voice emanating from south of the border. So thank you very much. And we will be sending you the report as soon as it is ready. Thank you. Meeting stands. Sorry, two things. At present, just wanted to inform all the members that the deadline for the upcoming study on the current situation in Iran was April 22nd, 2024. Should all of you agree, wanted to extend that to April 29th. Great. Unanimous consent? Excellent. The second thing I wanted to inform you is that the Nutrition International has requested a meeting with His Excellency Dr. Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete, the former president of Tanzania, and Dr. Ibrahim Asante Mayaki, who is the former Prime Minister of Niger. This is April 29th to May 2nd. The two of them will be here in Ottawa. If anyone is interested in being part of that meeting, please do send me an email. Yes, Mr. Chong.
On another point, I'm wondering if you could task the analysts with preparing a work plan for the Iran study.
Sure. Absolutely. Is that okay? Thank you very much. And the meeting stands adjourned.